Welcome back, Myrmidons, to another episode of The Wonder Women of Greek Mythology. Many of you have expressed your love and compassion for Oenone, the water nymph who was the first wife of Paris of Troy and the mother of his only son, Corythus. She plays a pivotal role in Paris's life, especially at the end. And like so many Greek myths, her story is rather a tragic one. If you're enjoying this podcast, then please download and subscribe to Greek Mythology Retold on your favorite podcast platform. It does help others find me and us as we enjoy exploring the characters behind the Trojan War. If this is your first time joining us, welcome to our world where we love Greek myths and all Trojan War related stories. I am Janelle Rhiannon, the writer and host of this podcast and author of the Homeric Chronicles, an adult Trojan War era retelling series. Let's get started with Oenone. She might not be the first character that comes to mind for most people when they think of the Trojan War, but her story brings us greater understanding about Paris and how, when prophecies were ignored in the ancient Greek mythological world, tragedy always ensued. That's really a concept that we can understand even today, isn't it? We might not use the word prophecy or fate, but we say things like, look for the red flags in relationships or situations, or listen to that inner voice. And then human nature kicks in, and we promptly ignore the red flag warnings, thinking we won't fall into that trap or become that person, only to glance in the rearview mirror weeks or months or, heaven forbid, even years later and think, yes, I should have paid attention to the red flag waving in my face or listening to that inner voice of wisdom. I do see myths as a way of examining human nature, so perhaps that's why we see so many Greek characters in myth completely ignoring flat-out warnings of prophecies, so we can learn to listen to our internal warning system, better known as our intuition. So back to Oenone's character. She not only helps define Paris as a figure in the Trojan War landscape, but also serves as a window into the plight of a woman, albeit a supernatural one, in times of ancient warfare. We know that Oenone is a nymph, but who or what were the nymphs exactly? Bear with me because there's a lot of information about the origin and types of nymphs. I promise I'm weaving all of this back to Oenone. Hesiod's Theogony, fragment 176, tells us the Melii or Meliades, the first nymphs, sprang from Gaia after the blood of Uranus, who had been castrated by Kronos, was spilled onto her from the heavens. Along with the Melii or Meliades, Gaia produced the Furies and the gleaming armored giants. Rather a beautiful expression, really, of mythological beings as the literal embodiment of heaven and earth entwined. The Meliades married the silver race of men who lived on the earth's surface rather than the air like the golden race of men, because at this phase of Greek myth world building, there were no women. The union between the Meliades and the silver race gave rise to the bronze race of man, called the third generation of mankind. The Meliades were fiercely and lovingly maternal beings, described as nursing their sons on the honey sap of the ash tree and arming them with spears carved from the ash trees. Now, this is like the Pelian ash spear carried by Achilles, which was a gift from his father, Peleus. The Bronze race lived only to about 100 years old, and they were defiant as a whole, and they refused to worship the immortals to Zeus's liking. This eventually led to their demise in the Great Deluge. And when you think about it, it's kind of sad. It means that the nymphs, who were immortal beings, could reproduce with mortals, but they were producing children that could only live to be 100. So that means that all of these immortal mothers were doomed to seeing their children die. They would be perpetually in mourning. This is very much Thetis' story with Achilles, and you can listen to her episode after this one if you like. I go into great detail about that. Hesiod's Theogony 240 catalogues several classifications of nymphs emerging from the Melii. There were nymphs who presided over bodies of salt water, like the Mediterranean, who were called the Nereides. They were the daughters of Nereus, the most famous among them being Thetis, Achilles' mother. The nymphs of freshwater bodies were known as the Naiades, which is the same kind of nymph that Oenone was. We get this from many sources from Homer, Apollonius of Rhodes, and Theocritus' Ideals. Many Naiades were believed to have the gift of prophecy, and mortals who drank from the springs and rivers they presided over believed that they were given prophetic and oracular gifts as well. This certainly holds true because we read that Oenone was well known for her gift of prophecy and her skill in the healing arts. From numerous sources we read that it was the Oreades who watched over the mountains and the foothills. What I find intriguing is that the Oreades were connected with the care of manna ash trees. The manna, or the meli, the sap of the ash, and the honey, meli, from bees, were both thought to be ambrosial foods gifted by the gods. Manna ash trees are found in a very limited geographical area encompassing the southwestern coast of Europe through Italy, the Mediterranean islands, all the way up the Balkan Peninsula to western Turkey, which would include the ancient Troas region. The medicinal property of the ash trees comes from the sap, or the honey, which is harvested in its hardened state. The sap is then supposed to cure various ailments, including constipation. Pseudo-Apollodorus, in his Bibliotheca 3:154, and Lycophron from Alexandria in the 61st fragment, confirm that Oenone was known as a healer and skilled with herbs and natural remedies for illness and poisons, as well as being a seer. Although she was a water-type nymph, she may have learned such healing skills from the Oreade nymphs residing in the region of Mount Ida. There is the tradition that Rhea graced Oenone with the gift of foresight and Apollo graced her with the healing arts. But I think it's credible to make a connection between Oenone and other nymphs who may have taught her about herbs and healing, or at least added to whatever gifts Apollo had granted. The one thing that all nymphs have in common, regardless of their classification, is that they are generally depicted as beautiful young women. And Paris, who we know first as a judge of beauty and later as a seducer of Helen, would certainly be drawn to a lovely immortal nymph. Pseudo-Apollodorus, among other ancient sources, confirms the paternal parentage of Oenone as the river Kebron. The Kebron River is a tributary of the Scamander River near the ancient city of Troy. Oenone is said to have been born at the river's headwaters where it dashed against the rocks. I envision a graceful and elegant nymph slipping from the tumultuous watery womb of Kebron to climb the slick shore, bare of garments, wide-eyed and ethereal. This immortal seer and healer would someday meet and marry the doom-bringer of Troy. Against her father's wishes, even after he warned her that she would suffer a tragic fate. According to the Book of Poets of Nicandros, a Greek poet of the 2nd century BC, and the Trojan history of Cephalon of Gergitha, who was actually Hesianix of Alexandria from the 2nd or 3rd century BC, Oenone met Paris when he was tending to his flocks on Ida, which is why I think there is a connection between Oenone and the Oreades. I wrote about Oenone meeting Paris as a young bull herder in the Song of Sacrifice in chapter 8, entitled Cattle Thieves and the Nymph, which is set in the foothills of Mount Ida in 1277 BCE. "Hello, is someone there?" Beyond the trees, a bull snorted, reminding Paris he must be cautious if he wanted to eat supper at the end of the day. If he got himself killed, there would be no one to tell the tale of how he saved the herd. He shrugged the laughter off as imagination. "Who are you?" a melodious voice questioned, as if swirling all around him. Paris turned quickly, catching sight of a woman, a kind of woman he'd never seen before. She was a creature of unparalleled grace and enchanting beauty, far surpassing any woman he'd seen, more enchanting than his mother Lexius, who looked like a mother, rounded, sturdy, and heavy-bosomed. This woman, if she was indeed a woman, exuded an otherworldly allure that captivated him. Her hair, long and flowing like cascading water, shimmered in an ever-changing palette of dark and shadowy hues. Her eyes, large and almond-shaped, mesmerized the young bull herder with their blue-green sheen, reminding him of the tranquil depths of secluded forest ponds. They beckoned him to study her more closely. Her skin was as pale as the morning light, a soft and radiant covering that glowed with an inner luminescence. "Who are you?" Paris pulled his bow from his shoulder, uncertain if the gods were playing a trick on him for killing the thieves, perhaps intending to draw him to some heinous punishment. The creature held up her hand. "I am not here to harm you." The tranquility of her voice made Paris lower his bow. Her delicate hand moved with a fluidity that mirrored the gentle ripples of a serene lake. She stepped closer with the gracefulness of a swan gliding on water. "Stop. Come no closer. You have not yet answered my question." "I am called Oenone," she said. Her voice was melodious, sweet, and haunting like a song that lulls a fussy babe to blissful sleep. There was a strange cadence to her speech, like a bubbling brook, quick and smooth. Oenone," Paris repeated. "What is your name?" Oenone asked. "Paris. And why do you sound like that?" "Like what?" Oenone's quiet laughter was contagious. Paris found himself smiling at her. He let his guard down and lowered his bow completely, sheathing his arrow. "What are you? Why are you smiling at me?" "No need to bother with your bow, Paris. I saw you kill the cattle thieves, but your bow is no match for me." Paris relaxed his stance but kept his eyes on her. "You surprised me. You make no noise when you walk." "I should hope not. Nymphs require absolute stealth to keep watch on their trees and streams. These are my father's lands." Paris looked her up and down. "You're a nymph? A wood nymph or a water nymph?" "Water." "Well, where do you come from?" "Where the river Kibron washes over the foothills of the sacred mountain. I sprang to life where the cascading falls make love to the rocks." "You're immortal then, too? Such questions. Do you not have cattle to tend?" Paris eyed her undeterred. "Are you or aren't you?" "Yes, I'm immortal," Oenone smiled, revealing pearly white teeth. "We nymphs know many things, but why are you named Paris after a backpack?" "Because I was carried from these mountains by my father in a backpack." "Paris is as good a name as any other," Oenone said. When you say my name, it sounds pleasant, not like my elder brothers who make it sound like a curse." "Well, that's unfortunate." Oenone shed a single tear on his behalf, catching it on the tip of her delicate finger. It crystallized into a sparkling gem. "Take this, young Paris, to remember me." Paris suspiciously took the unusual token, while he contemplated what his brothers might say or do to him if he showed them the gift. "Are you going to take it or not, Paris?" He took the offering and put it in his satchel. "Yes, this will prove that I met a nymph. No one believes me when I tell them my stories." Oenone kissed the top of his head. "Off with you then, cattle to mind and stories to tell, I suppose." Paris asked, "Will I see you again?" "I have no doubt, young Paris, hero of the fields, defender of man and beast." Pseudo-Apollodorus, among other mythographers of his time, agree that Paris eventually took Oenone to wife and away from her father. They made a home in the foothills of Mount Ida, which is where he tended his herds. Any relationship between an immortal and a mortal is going to be complicated, to say the least. He takes Oenone away from her routine and the comforts of how she had been living up until this time, and as with all Greek myths, love and happiness don't last too long. Prior to all of this cozy bliss, the three goddesses, Athena, Aphrodite, and Hera, forced Paris to judge who among them was the most fair. When Aphrodite won, she promised Paris the most beautiful woman in the world. If you follow my earlier podcasts on the timeline of these events, you'll see that Helen wasn't quite yet born. Check out episodes 1 through 3 for a deep dive into the development of this Trojan War timeline. Okay, back to Oenone. Here's where things get interesting. From the Book of Poets of Nigandros and the Trojan War history of Cephalon, we read that Paris professed his love for Oenone quite frequently, always swearing he would never abandon her. Sounds like love bombing or an overcompensation for underlying guilt. I see this as evidence that perhaps he already knows the most beautiful woman in the world is coming his way at some point. He just doesn't know when, and is perhaps hoping Aphrodite will forget or change her mind. For the present and immediate future, he does love Oenone. He just has no idea when or how the goddess might compel him to leave the nymph he genuinely loves. This is a common theme in Greek mythology, a character thinking that they can outsmart or flat out deny the will of the gods. We know that eventually he's going to have to face the fact that he will do whatever Aphrodite wants him to do. Oenone's gift of prophecy was both a gift and a curse, which makes me think that maybe we only like the idea of knowing the future when it's a benefit, like you're going to win $1 million or you're going to get the house you've always wanted. Mostly, when we get predictions of bad news, there's the knee-jerk reaction to get upset and deny it. Anyway, Oenone saw the bleak future for her and Paris, so she met his enthusiasm with skepticism and a healthy dose of realism. She actually told him point blank that he would leave her someday for a foreign woman from the West, and by doing so, he would bring the doom of his family and city. Of course, Paris definitely didn't want that, so he denies even more vehemently. Oenone also told Paris that when a future war, which of course is the Trojan War, happened, that he would be wounded and he should seek out her healing care because only she would have the power to save him. If Paris had already encountered the goddesses and had this long hang time until he had to deal with whatever came, he could afford a bit of denial. Okay, a lot of denial. That's human nature, isn't it? Deny a painful truth until you're pushed to the brink and forced to accept it. Of course, Paris ignored her warning and was said to even be offended. Just really sounds like guilt, doesn't it? In time, of course, Oenone would be proven right, because we all know that Helen of Sparta would make her grand entrance onto the Trojan stage. But until that time, Paris and Oenone lived rather peacefully and happily. They even had a son named Corythus. With the birth of a child, both their lives were now entwined in a forever kind of knot, a marriage. Because Oenone was an immortal, she would face the same fate as Thetis, knowing that someday her mortal children would die and she would mourn them forever. I can only imagine, if Thetis's example bears any similarity, that Oenone spent as much time with Corythus as possible, perhaps even dreamed of making him immortal. She likely taught him about the natural world they lived in, and at least in the beginning, Paris would have been present. It wouldn't be until years later that Oenone would send Corythus to Troy to live with Paris. Somewhere in this marital bliss, Paris discovered his actual identity as the forgotten prince of Troy. And after this revelation, he began the process of getting to know his real parents, Queen Hecuba and King Priam of Troy. With his new family came exposure to a world he had only ever seen at a distance. He was thrust into the world of Trojan royalty. Fine clothes, gold, gems, expensive horses, a luxurious palace. We can't be sure how exactly he transitions to living full-time in Troy, but we know he's been there long enough for Priam to entrust him with a personal quest to speak to Hesione. We can assume that Paris split his time between his first wife and son and his newfound family, at least for a while. We don't read anywhere that Oenone was welcomed into Troy. Once Paris is dispatched by Priam as an envoy to speak with Hesione, Oenone knew that what she had foreseen was coming to pass. In the love romances of Parthenius, we read that after Paris returned with Helen, Oenone and presumably Corythus went back to live with her father, Chebron, the river that bore his name, and the surrounding area. After the deaths of Hector and Achilles, the Greeks and Trojans were still fighting, with the skirmishes swinging wildly in favor of one side and then the other as the gods intervened. Since this episode isn't about Paris but Oenone, I'll cut to the chase. Paris gets wounded by the poisoned arrow of Philocletes and remembers what Oenone had spoken of years ago. Pseudo-Apollodorus says that Paris sought out Oenone on Mount Ida, but she was still heartbroken by his abandonment and disgusted by what he'd done to Corythus because of Helen, that she refused to heal him. What happened between Corythus and Helen and Paris is a whole other episode. Parthenius says that Paris sent a messenger, and Oenone sent back a bitter reply that perhaps Helen could heal him instead. Either way, Oenone initially refuses to use her skills to save Paris's life. After her initial refusal, however, she does have a change of heart and goes to Troy to save Paris. But she arrives too late. He has already died. There's a bit of divergence about what happened to Oenone after this. Pseudo-Apollodorus tells us that she hanged herself after she found out that Paris had died. Parthenius says only that she ended her own life. Lycophron records that she threw herself off the ramparts, presumably to her death. Quintus Smyrnaeus, in his Fall of Troy, gives yet another version of Oenone's suicide, that she threw herself into the pyre flames and died clasping Paris in her arms. All we can say then is that the myths, no matter how they diverge, come back to some version of Oenone's suicide. It's such an unsatisfying end to a character who seemed quite pure in motive and intention, even naive compared to Paris. But perhaps that's exactly what Oenone's story is supposed to represent. She is the long-suffering, patient wife, the same light that Penelope and Andromache are bathed in. These three were juxtaposed with the morally tainted Helen and Clytemnestra. It's through conversation and time that we can find the gray area in between. For me, I see that the myths are heavily invested in the god's will being the reason behind everything good and bad. Did Paris really have a choice? Did Oenone have to go with Paris from the beginning when she knew that he would eventually leave her? Why did Paris think that Oenone would care about him after everything he did or allowed to happen? Maybe ancient love affairs are not so different from modern ones. We all have that one person we think about when we know we shouldn't. We all have at least one friend who, despite our warnings, takes the ex back and regrets it. Love is, after all, complicated. It can be beautiful and uplifting, but it can also be messy, bittersweet, and tragic. Oenone's life in the background of the Trojan War landscape has captivated artists for thousands of years. Ovid, who was a Latin poet, flourishing in Rome in the late 1st century BC and early 1st century AD during the reign of the Emperor Augustus, wrote about Oenone. His works included the Heroides, a collection of poems in the form of letters from heroines to their lovers. He wrote a fictional letter from Oenone to Paris. I did include this little historical gem in my Greek myth series 3rd book, Rage of Queens, and also in this episode. The Getty Museum houses a set of wooden panels painted in 1460 by Francesco di Giorgio Martini, which ironically adorned an Italian wedding chest, which were often painted with mythological themes and characters. I found the piece that the Getty Museum houses to be ironic because of the love story of Oenone and Paris, and that it's tragic and sad. The panels illustrate Paris gifting the golden apple to Aphrodite, a transaction known as the Judgment of Paris. Another panel shows Oenone carrying a bow, alluding to Paris's future fatal wound, and on another panel we see Oenone begging Paris not to leave her as he rides off, ironically, on a white horse. Perhaps this choice of content was meant to remind the medieval bride to be patient with whatever long suffering she might have to endure for the sake of her marriage. Another artwork that I came across is by Harriet Hosmer, who is an American sculptress, and she made a life-sized carving of Oenone between 1854 and 1855. It is housed in the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum at Washington University. I suggest that you look this piece up online. It somehow captures the broken spirit of Oenone in a pure white marble. It really does capture the sorrowfulness of Oenone's story, and it's really quite lovely. There is a bittersweet lining to Oenone's story, however tragic it ended. She has been immortalized through time in stories, poems, and artwork, along with other relatively silent heroines associated with the Trojan War. That brings this episode to its end. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe. I've enjoyed sharing what I've researched about Oenone with you. My readers tell me she's one of their favorite characters in the Homeric Chronicles series, which is a Trojan War retelling for adults. You can pick that up at Amazon in ebook or paperback if you're feeling like a nice, spicy read. Well, that's about all for now. Until next time, drink your wine and be merry, Myrmidons.